right, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political, sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I am here today with Dr. James Lindsay. He is back for the second time. If you have not checked the first episode, you should definitely do that. And if you're watching on YouTube, you should know that they cut it in half. So we had to put up a second episode, which was very interesting if you notice exactly where they cut it in half. But anyway, Dr. James Lindsay is a doctor of math, and I am convinced that he has somehow figured out how to bend the space-time continuum, because he has more hours in the day than I do, apparently, to get all the stuff done that he does, and to still fight with trolls on Twitter. And he's an author, and he has a really great podcast, New Discourses, which if you're not listening to, you should. I highly recommend. I always tell people I'm the annoying person who sends all the books and all the white papers to people, but I recognize a lot of people don't have the time or the inclination to read them. So the next best thing to do would be to listen to him analyze them. How are you doing today?
I'm all right. I've recovered from COVID, so we're getting back on track.
I understand. Yeah, it was definitely a challenge for me as well. And I was just telling you, I've never been quite as sick recurrently as I have this year. But yeah, so well, let's dive in. I one of the first things I wanted to kind of dive into is it's been considered a conspiracy theory for so long, but now I think people are starting to recognize that it's not a conspiracy theory, that it is real. We are living through the Great Reset. And I'm curious if you've noticed parallels to the administrative state and the stakeholder capitalism put forth in the Great Reset.
I mean, that's kind of, as far as I can tell, how it's made to work is kind of through the administrative state apparatus. The Great Reset is what's going on right now, kind of fumbling, but they have a very long-term plan. And so it's not like it's just going to go away, but, obviously it was going to be predicated off of using the public health apparatus and thus the administrative apparatus that enforces that, whether that's the FDA, the CDC, OSHA, et cetera, to use, as Klaus Schwab, the architect of the Great Reset, as he said it, we have a very narrow window of opportunity to use a COVID-19 pandemic to reset the world. And it's like, well, okay, so they're trying to use the COVID-19 pandemic to do it. And how are they going to do that? Well, it's through these administrative apparatuses. So, for example, the Biden administration tried to put forth a vaccine mandate that for employers, above a certain threshold of employees, and it was said to be unconstitutional. And they said, no, we're going to do it through OSHA. We're going to claim that the administrative apparatus, which is technically obviously underneath the purview of the executive branch, is now going to be authorized to implement what, as we have now seen, was an unconstitutional mandate on people. And so there are a few different pieces, but basically, a government in a country like the United States doesn't have the authority, in its constitutional form at least, to put something like the Great Reset onto the people. And so they are using both the administrative, the kind of very grown and bloated administrative apparatus, where you have unaccountable bureaucrats who were not elected, who are going to be the ones who are going to, in these agencies, that are going to enforce all of the policies. And they are policies, not laws. And then secondly, they're also using the corporations to do the bidding of government where the government is not legally allowed to do so. For example, we just saw both the Surgeon General and the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, came out and said that we need to be doing more to pressure Spotify to censor Joe Rogan. And the government not only does it not have the authority to do that, it's a blatant First Amendment violation. And as a matter of fact, it's already well established Supreme Court jurisprudence. It is well-established precedent that the government cannot request that private actors do for them that which they are not legally allowed to do. So this is a direct First Amendment violation by at least both the Surgeon General and the White House press secretary, so therefore the White House, to say nothing of Congress people who have also spoken up in this regard, Democratic Congresswomen primarily, who have spoken up in this regard, again, going outside of the constitutional authority that they have, violating the First Amendment to do so illegally. So then what? Well, how do you hold them accountable? Well, you come back to the administrative apparatus that's not doing what it's supposed to do, like the Justice Department, et cetera, is not taking the action that it should be taking to deal with this. The oversight just isn't there because these entities, corporations, and the administrative apparatus are so thoroughly captured that we're not seeing the protections guaranteed to Americans by the Constitution being able to be upheld. And so it's you can see how the corruption works when you start to look at it in that regard.
Right. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit too, because I know you've done so much deep dives on the New Left, and they were really, I think, the ones who gave such credence to the administrative state. And they, in fact, that's what they would talk about, is how we were now going to have these quote unquote experts who had to consult with the government. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about the genesis of that and how that ties into, I think it's paved the way for what we're seeing now.
Yeah. So in this, I mean, there was stuff going on within the genesis of that's actually long and kind of complicated, and certainly not deep into my area of expertise. But, the discipline, if you will, the academic discipline of public administration has been since at least the 1950s. What was that guy's name? Dwight. He's got a funny last name and I always forget it. There's a fellow who actually wrote a book called The Administrative State in the 50s. And he ended up putting on a conference in the 60s. And that's where the concept of social equity theory was hashed out for the first time. And the idea that it's going to be necessary for the administrative apparatus, not just to focus on efficiency and economy. So, are we doing efficient processes within government? Are we doing economical? Are we making economical decisions in terms of how we administer public policy and public works? But also they said that we need to introduce social equity as a third pillar of public administration. So you can see that the kind of very leftist Marxist really agenda was creeping in through the administrative apparatus. And of course they would want it to, because the constitutional process is too slow and too divided in its powers and too internally accountable to allow for a Marxist takeover of the United States. So you have to have a huge bloated bureaucratic apparatus that it can colonize in order for it to work. And so the history of, the administrative state apparatus being relevant in this way. And when we're talking about, the big conference that I mentioned was in 1968, when you start talking about things that were happening in the 1960s that were vaguely left, you are talking about the New Left. And the New Left was this kind of, conglomerate movement of neo-Marxists who were figuring out that classical Marxism didn't work for various reasons, but they still wanted to achieve Marxist ends. And then also other left-leaning, radicals and not even radicals, just, hard left oriented progressive types. And they kind of had this movement that it actually arose for a little while, and it wasn't very influential for very long because the radical elements kept doing violent things and people didn't like them. And they were internally fighting quite a lot, as they do. And it didn't really go very far. But what they ended up doing, they made out of this, was recorded, for example, in this book called The Critical Turn in Education, which says this right from the very beginning, is that the New Left rapidly fell apart by the mid-1970s. But its ethos didn't go away. But what happened was they realized that they needed to create, out of the ashes of the New Left, they created what they call an academic left. And so this is where your expert class is going to come in. So you've got this administrative thing growing, and they are going to staff that with relevant experts. And then what they decided to do was to shift their attention out of the streets and into the classrooms, into the university classrooms in particular. And so it's the grooming of experts became, this academic left became the grooming of people who are going to put this sort of policy in place, and they were going to be the hand-picked ideal administrators who were going to make their way into that administrative apparatus, groomed in the best universities, of course, to fill those roles. And you can kind of see the whole corruption taking place in a number of pieces and steps through, maybe 65 through about 1980 or so, as this kind of these two behemoths started to grow: the administrative apparatus on the one hand, and the academic left to staff it with the relevant so-called experts on the other hand. And, if I'm not exactly a technocracy kind of guy myself, but one can understand the impulse that you do want informed experts, making kinds of decisions. And if you're going to have an administrative apparatus, you do want the experts in there. The problem is that when you have this extraordinary political bias in terms of what qualifies somebody as being as an expert, or that qualifies as, you have to say the correct things to be considered to have expertise, then you've got a big growing problem on your hands. And then when those are the people that are going to be empowered to administer policy, you have an even bigger problem on your hands. You have the making of an illegitimate technocracy that is subverting the republic at that point.
Yeah, and the New Left, they did, that was part of their policy. They said that it couldn't be extricated. The part of being an expert was that you were politically aligned. So
yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Problematic. I'm not sure how expertise and political correctness are synonymous, but somehow they made the two synonymous. But you had recently tweeted saying that you had blown your own mind going down the Marxist rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what in particular spawned that.
So I've been on this kind of deep dive for my New Discourses podcast. I've been trying to do this very long and sprawling series that I think is going to comprise 30 or 40 plus podcasts by the time it's actually done, into critical education. So critical theory as it gets applied to education. Sometimes it's called critical education theory. Sometimes it's called critical pedagogy. That's usually the word that they use. And so anyway, the critical turn in education, basically, how did our education system become Marxist? And so I'm starting in the middle of the story. Unfortunately, I haven't taken the time to go back and study people like John Dewey and all of the so-called social reformers or school reformers, the movement that began kind of in the 1918, really, when public school became compulsory, was 1918. And immediately the Marxists seized upon this bureaucratic opportunity to start skewing education. And so the school reformers like Dewey, et cetera, started to redwash our education there. I'm actually starting my story, with about 1970. So I'm following this book, The Critical Turn in Education, that I mentioned. And I'm going through it. And what I'm doing is I'm going through that book and then going into the various other books that it cites. So if it brings up a book of some, not just mentions some small book, but something of significance, I then divert out of the main thread of the podcast series and go into that other text. And so I diverted into a book from 1985 called The Politics of Education by Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is a Brazilian Marxist who ruined everything, and the simplest way to put it. And but total Marxist education program. And he brought something new to kind of the Marxist movement, which was faltering by the mid 1980s, kind of in general, in most departments. In fact, most people thought that Marxism was on the way out finally, for the last time, outside of maybe China. And it turns out that in North Korea, and it turns out that wasn't the case. And so I'm reading Freire and this book, and I'm going through for the podcast various things, and it just becomes impossible to understand how did Freire become so popular? What in the world made him, what does he represent? Because if you read the people who read Freire, or who brought Freire in, they have this almost, faith-like or religious-like or cult-like devotion to the guy. And it reads very much like they found their, magic guru who has told them the secrets to all of life. And so I'm reading the Freire, and then I'm thinking, the only way to comprehend what's going on here, as far as I can tell, is to understand that Marxism is a theology and that Freire is one of its later and most effective prophets.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I don't know if it's a good idea to draw any particular biblical comparisons to which prophet or whatever he might be, but definitely he fulfills the role of a religious prophet who's kind of bringing the people back. They've lost their faith in the Marxist theology, and he's bringing the people back to faith. If you follow the Old Testament, that's basically what the prophets work out to be. The Israelites lose their way, they betray God or deny God or step away from God or whatever, and then some prophet arises that speaks the truth of God again to them and brings them back into the graces of God and gets them back on track for a little while, and then they screw up again, and another prophet comes along, and that's basically the Old Testament over and over and over again. With Jesus, you know, people wouldn't say he's a prophet exactly unless you're a Muslim or something, but coming along is kind of the last one in that sequence. Well, Freire turns out to be one of these prophets for the Marxist theology. But if I say the Marxist theology, I have to explain what a Marxist theology is, because nobody thinks of it that way. They think it's an economic theory. It's not. It is actually a religion. It is a theology all the way to the bottom. It answers questions about what it means to be a human. It answers questions about what meaning in life is. It explains actually what the nature of being itself is. It has an entire religious architecture, values, what truth and knowledge represent. It has an entire theological construct built within it. And so I started to read a lot of the older Marx, the stuff that he wrote in the early 1840s before he was writing, say, the Communist Manifesto, which is 1848. Well, 47, 48. I think he finished the manifesto at the very end of 47, and it was published in 48. But at any rate, you know, his earlier writings, 1844, he had a number of very religious flavored writings. His critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, for example, his economic and philosophic manuscripts, which are also known as the 1844 manuscripts. So I went and read those, looking into this and taking kind of survey of how does this fit kind of a theological model. What's the theodicy? What's the soteriology? What's the eschatology? They're all there, right? Yep. How did Marx actually see this? And so I dig in, and finally I blow my mind by fully connecting with the idea. I mean, it was an extraordinarily stressful process. It was really a deep, ugly dive into Marx's early, most kind of theoretical writing. And I came out of this with my mind blown and rather profoundly changed in my understanding of how Marx and Marxism works. And it's to understand that it's a religion. It is ultimately a very dark, inverted faith that's goal is to tear everything down so as to, well, I mean, they want to tear everything down because they think the existing system is intrinsically stuck in a pattern of domination and oppression. And so if you're going to get away from that, you have to tear everything that exists down, because that's the only way you can stop the domination and oppression. But it actually is also a theory of spiritual renewal. And kind of the simplest way to put it is that it's a religion that the goal is submission to the collective. Man has to realize that he's actually a social creature. And so therefore he awakens to his true consciousness of what he really is by becoming socialist man. And socialist man, however, only obtains within a socialist society. And in the long end, when communism arrives, socialist man in socialist society become co-continuous. Man and society are no different from one another anymore, because man is completely submissive to his social nature. And true freedom is therefore bowing 100% completely to the collective in every single person. And there's a lot more to it. And people have commented, the podcast I did on Marxist theology, it's about 3.5 hours long, and people have commented that it's the first one that I've done where they just couldn't keep up with the ideas. It's just that difficult. So I put that I blew my mind on Twitter, because it was right out at the edge of what I'm really cognitively capable of doing. And I mean, it's so weird. It's kind of strange to say it, but I actually have this bad habit of rubbing my face when I'm thinking really hard. I rubbed my face so hard and so thoroughly that I rubbed a bald spot on one side of my chin.
Wow.
not even realizing that I was doing that while I was trying to parse out this idea. It's all grown back now, but I actually rubbed, this big rectangular bald spot when I was stroking my beard too hard, trying to figure this out and understand it. And so the podcast is out there. People say it's very difficult, and hopefully over time I can kind of simplify the arguments within it and help people see it. But I think that,
Listen to it. I thought it was fantastic. I thought you
that's
did
the key.
Yep. There were several things that came up for me. One, I just want to comment on this whole notion of tearing down. I think it's really relevant to say that a lot of people don't realize when they say build back better, first you have to tear down in order to build back. That's the part they leave out. Yeah. The other thing that came up for me is I feel like I need to reread Heidegger, because I don't know how familiar you are with his works, but it seems like he was very clearly, very heavily influenced by both Marx and Hegel in a very theological way.
Yeah, actually, I think that's probably important. One of them, I'm not exactly as expert in Heidegger as I need to be for what's going on.
I think he paved the way also for the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany. Yeah, go on.
Right. No, yeah. Well, with Heidegger, the kind of key theological idea that I end up going back to a lot, and there are a lot, obviously, his book is what is being on being or something like this. And,
being in time. Yeah.
Being in time. That's it. Yeah. And so he's, those are deeply ontological concepts. But the one that I really go back to is, what does he call it in German? Geworftheit or something like this, flungness, having been thrown in. Yeah. And so this is ultimately actually the key idea that I've derived from what little Heidegger I really understand. And it's this, that the view within this broad Marxian faith is, in fact, this is a Gnostic idea, is that we have been flung into the world. Our stupid parents, if you want to start there, or you could say that it was stupid God, whoever, somebody made us. And we didn't ask to be made, and we've been flung into the world, and the world wasn't made for us. We didn't even nobody asked me if I wanted to be born. And here I am flung into this world that's not made. It's not giving me what I want. I'm not getting my way with it. It's a miserable experience that I've been flung into the world that's not made for me. And if I had had the opportunity to be asked ahead of time, do you really want to be part of this world? I would have been, looked at the prospects and said, probably not, but I got flung in anyway. And so this is a very Gnostic way of looking at the world, is that human beings have been flung into the world, and we are, in a sense, alienated from our true nature and our true happiness, our path to happiness and our true liberation, by the fact that we've been flung into this world without our consent, and that we are in fact jailed in this world as a result of that. And so, if we get theological with it, then, God is held up not to be deity, but rather as a demon who created man to prove that he can be creator. And now we're going to get real deep. And so he created man to prove that he's actually creator. And he puts us in the garden, which was actually our birthright in the first place. And but then throws us out of it, flings us out we're flung out into the world again. And because we disobeyed him. But he's actually, we're like if you, to use a modern analogy rather than the Garden of Eden, it's like he's a computer programmer and he built the simulation and built us. And so we were his little like digipets. And then, so he's actually this cruel thing. And then he's thrown us out of he's like, oh yeah, you didn't do exactly what I want. Now I'm going to make your life miserable. But the view is actually from the Marxist perspective is that no, we that was our birthright and you're fake, and eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge was going to make us like you. In other words, going to make us into creators ourselves. And then we don't need you and can see you as what you really are, which is evil and a demon. And that's really the roots of, we can put it in the phrasing of Marx like that, but that's really the roots of Gnosticism all the way back, even in a kind of very religious, mystical kind of way, that has nothing to do with the scientific approach or scientistic approach of Marx. And so I focus on, as far as Heidegger goes, I think it's probably important to read him again, but it's to really just understand that they fundamentally believe that it is a curse to have been born. And the reason that it's a curse is because the world is not made for you. And so if you can get everybody to rearrange the world to suit you, that curse goes away. And we, as you know, if you go to Herbert Marcuse, he says in Eros and Civilization in 60 or in 55, he says, you know, we can get back into the Garden of Eden. And the way we do it is by taking another bite of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. For Marx, he says, you know, everything comes down to you are as a subject and object in dialectical relationship. So you're a subject and you create in your mind an image of what you want to see in the world, and you bring it into the world. And then by reflecting upon that, you realize yourself as creator. You don't need a creator outside of you. You are creator. And man, by being creator, by being creative, by doing productive work, creates the world. He creates his own conditions, but he also creates himself. He authors history. He raises man out of the position of being in the just mere animal, but he also comes to know himself as that which can create. In other words, like God. And so you have this long, continuous Gnostic belief that we've been flung out into the world, this situation's intolerable, and that there's secret special knowledge that allows you to get back into, you know, kind of paradise. And it turns out that the secret knowledge is that, hey, we're actually social, which if you boil it down to what they really mean is, if everybody else does what I want them to do, then I have a great life. And that's what it really means to be social, is everybody else has to do what I want them to do. But then they have, you know, they're not that coarse. They say there's intersubjectivity. You have your subjectivity, I have my subjectivity. So I have to do what you want and you have to do what I want, with no domination whatsoever. And that can only happen when we have co-continuous consciousness, that we actually have the same wants, and that therefore we must, again, submit ourselves to a perfect social order. But it will always so conveniently be that it's everybody has to behave the way that people like Karl Marx and Martin Heidegger want them to behave in order to make their miserable lives less miserable. Like, make everything work for me, and then I won't feel flung into the world anymore. And that's my birthright. And there's this gross entitlement at the center of all of this kind of Gnostic philosophy, whether that's pre-scientific or whether that's Marxist and therefore modern scientific in flavor.
Well, there's so much to parse out in that, but I would say, right? But I would say the scientistic, you know, we'll call it, for lack of a better, I see that as a tool, you know, a teleological tool for their ends, which you can certainly speak on. But there are a few other things I want to say. The whole wokeist movement, I feel like, is you know, certainly the Frankfurt School talks about this a lot, you know, that their agenda was to normalize the outliers. And that is exactly this, you know, make, you know, the world around me suit me, even if I'm, you know, I'm one person in the whole world.
Yeah.
And that's the way we do that. And then my third kind of thing that I'd love you to speak on. I don't know if you're familiar with Richard, I'm going to butcher his name, Wurmbrand, his work, and Paul Kenger. I'm going to butcher both of them, but they both, they both wrote on Marx's Ode to Satan, which.
Oh, right. I know about that. I don't know either of their work, but I do know a little bit about that. That mentality. Yeah, Marx, people don't realize, actually was avowedly a Satanist.
Yeah.
And
it makes sense when you start going down the Marxist rabbit hole. It seemed perfectly satanic.
Yeah, it is. It is a perfect inversion of the natural order, because it starts with the premise that one can come to see themselves as creator by bringing your creation into the world. And so whether you want to put it in terms of Satan, whether you want to put it in terms of Prometheus, who Marx also invoked frequently in his kind of mythological writing, or if you want to put it in terms of Pygmalion, the Greek myth of the Pygmalion myth, you see this again and again and again in the underlying mentality, certainly there.
Yeah. So it's interesting when you talk about the narcissistic, entitled perspective of, you know, this Marxist philosophy. And I think it's really interesting when you, as you've outlined so much, you know, queer theory, which is one of the key tool components of the woke movement, and how, you know, they don't want you to have an essence. And so essentially it is to destabilize identities. I've noticed this trend. I talked about this like 10 years ago. I was really seeing an uptick in, or just, anecdotally, observationally, not clinically, we'll say, but in a rise of narcissistic borderline personality disorder. And I really felt like it was, I'm going to be conspiratorial about this, but I really do feel like it was by design, because, one of the key components of usurpation and ideological subversion is demoralization and destabilization. And so if you have a destabilized society and individuals who have no essence, then you have a much easier time of rising to power. So yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, I've kind of abandoned believing that this was just well-intended things that went wrong. The self-esteem movement in the schools was particularly damaging in this regard. It was a gigantic source of a rise of kind of unqualified self-pride, aka narcissism, in young people. And I'm starting to conclude that I think it was largely intentional and groomed. And then you add in the queer theory with the destabilization of identity, which wasn't particularly strong until maybe the last 10 years. But then you start to get this impression like this has been a sequential kind of stage-based thing. The narcissism has actually really seemed to have increased. But of course, when you look at the philosophy, however you want to look at it, that's what you should expect. That the idea is that you're going to have to, you're at the bottom, in kind of the Heideggerian sense, you're telling kids you've been flung into this world, nobody understands you, and everything's miserable because of everything else, but you're the one who's kind of the center that's never wrong. Your subjective experience is the author of reality and is never wrong. And what you're going to do and then what makes you special is just being who you were born as, like not what you've accomplished, not what you've done, but just having been born the way that you were born. That's what makes you fundamentally special. And this isn't developmentally appropriate because it's going to engender the kinds of personality disorders that we're seeing. The other thing is that so many of our role models are going to be personality disordered, and we know that one of the causes of personality disorders is children being exposed to inappropriate relationships, say, for example, that break down the structural barriers between adulthood and childhood. Schizoid personality disorder is almost completely conclusively found to be that caused by when you have inappropriate, emotionally deep relationships between adults and children in the age range of like 6 to 10 years old in particular. It could be later, maybe earlier, but not saying that there's sexual abuse or something like that, but rather inappropriate emotional reliance by adults on children. But you look at the critical pedagogy idea, and it says that we should be breaking down the barrier between adult and child, teacher and student. The student should be elevated as the actual authority, as the actual teacher. And then you mix in these other elements like the queer theory that, you're special the way that you were born. But how are you really born? Well, it's not that you were born a boy. Somebody just wrote that on your birth certificate. It's who you actually feel like. And then any weird feeling you have should be indulged, because we have to get further and further into the other. You can start to see that. And then, again, you have this inappropriate dissolving of the boundaries that children need to develop appropriately, and the result will be personality disorders. And we're seeing that rampantly in so many kids, and as they grow into adults, and the rates of personality disorders, depression, anxiety, etc., are off the charts, because all of this is a giant failure. Kind of deeper in the theory, you talk about this, the outsiders with the Marxist, the Frankfurt School goal. Well, I mean, again, we've talked about the Gnostic elements of this, and people get upset when I talk about this, but there's a Hermetic, in other words, alchemy based element to this as well. And the belief there is that God can't understand himself without creating an abject other by which he understands himself. And so everything, if you read Marx, if you read queer theory, as two ends of the same spectrum of literature, you see everywhere this focus on the other, always looking at how the thing is the other. I think
you're talking a lot about this too, actually, the other.
Yeah. So so for Marx, the object, you are the subject and the object is the other. So that which is going on in your head is that which is real. And then the world outside, the objective world outside, is other to you. as you come to understand yourself as, but your goal is to understand yourself as that which creates that which is outside of your own head. That's the so-called dialectic of the subject and the object, which in the end, that they will be sublated, and you will end up having no true division between subject and object. The subject will see himself in the object, and the object will be the true reflection of the subject, and they become co-continuous. This is the dialectical nature of this. In queer theory, it's the exact same thing. So you're not who you are, you're constantly in a process of becoming who you are. And how do you do that? By setting yourself as an oppositional other to everything else in the world. So stable sense of identity means that you've decided to stabilize too soon. You've forgone what you could become, and you've actually fallen into the trap that and they would say that you've objectified yourself and lost your subjectivity, sacrificed your subjectivity to the social relations that have conditioned you to decide this is where you're supposed to accept yourself. And it's a complete catastrophe. It's just a complete catastrophe. This is a very poisonous philosophy, where now the goal with queer theory is to do alchemy on yourself, to enter into a permanent state of transition. Not that you're becoming your best you, like something motivational, or that you're constantly striving to improve versus yesterday, but rather that you are actually becoming something that you are not, which is the creator, for example, of yourself. Like, for example, with your body, putting yourself through all of these hormones and surgeries and all of these other behaviors. And this is always a thing with Marxism, is that they are going to try to take the front leading edge of technology and say that we finally have the capacity to do this. So right now, the front leading edge of technology allows people to take hormones. It allows people to undergo cosmetic surgeries to remove their breasts or remove their genitals or change their genitals or do facial reconstruction surgery. And sooner or later, the front edge of that technology is going to be further down the road of completely, remaking yourself, say through, something that influences how your brain works, or, whatever else. And they constantly believe this kind of transhumanist remaking man at a fundamental level kind of thing, or that you can plug into the machine and you get to be whatever avatar you want to be. If you want to be a man today, a woman tomorrow, whatever, in the metaverse, you are that. There's this kind of constant belief that we are at the edge of technology that allows us to overcome the nature that we've been flung into against our will, that oppresses us by the fact that it's not serving exactly whatever our subjective whims are. And that's the poison at the heart of this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you tied that together, because I think people often don't see, the convergence of the Marxist philosophy and the technocratic agenda and the transhuman agenda, and they are, a synthesis of one another.
That's right.
Stem from, yeah.
Yeah, they think that they're wizards.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be the simple way to say it, essentially. Yeah.
They think that they're wizards who ultimately will be able to have like complete control and dominion over everything, over reality itself. Or we'll just remake reality to be whatever it is we need it to be. And the way that we'll achieve that is by putting the people who have the correct understanding and power over everything. And
Right.
So the bid for that right now are these stakeholders and the public-private partnership, et cetera, going through the Great Reset, or coming out on the other side of the Great Reset, which the Great Reset is just a lever. The Great Reset is a tool. And the goal is to achieve what they are calling the fourth industrial revolution, which isn't quite correct. I think that we are going through, because of the advent of AI and technology and the computers and every other thing, social media, et cetera, we are going through a fourth industrial revolution, like the other three, where there's a fundamental change in how things are going to have to be organized, how things are going to be done, because technology is going to fundamentally change the nature of work. It's going to fundamentally change a lot of things. And we're going to have to sort out what that looks like for people. Right. What these weirdos have is they think they have the solution to what that's going to look like. They're going to be the ones who are going to, their goal is to remake mankind itself.
The hive mind, recursal singularity. I have it somewhere here.
Yeah, exactly. And so they, their goal isn't to have this be an actual industrial revolution where, the changes in technology cause a big revolution in the way that we have to do things and even organize society, but rather to use that as an excuse to force some crackpot plan on everybody, where we're going to remake everything in the world to this kind of circular economy sustainability model with them in charge, of course, and that the people who are in the so-called creative class, who, as they put it, the people who will still be employable on the other side of the so-called industrial revolution, because they can't imagine what the poor plebs will do. They have no idea. So they have to put them just in kind of a socially managed equity system where everybody gets UBI and lives in a pod and eats bugs. But the elites won't. The elites, in fact, the anointed will be given, they believe, magical medical technology and computer interfaces or robot cyborg type interfaces where they think they're going to live forever. They're going to be extraordinarily super intelligent, and they're going to be able to, they're going to rightfully rule over the rest of the world with these technological enhancements and their eternal life. Like you saw in Time Magazine. Time Magazine had an article a year and a change ago where it said 2045, the year that mankind becomes immortal. And it shows a literal picture of like a mannequin being plugged into the matrix, like with a wire sticking out of its head. And it's like, that's what they think that they're going to achieve. The fundamental transformation of man rather than the transformation of society by technology. It's going to be the fundamental transformation of man by technology. And then when you go back and read things like Marxism, he's saying a biological foundation for socialism and an essay on liberation. And he starts talking about how you create conditions where you introject a morality until people don't know how to live without it. And it's going to be the socialist morality. So then what do you create them into? The socialist man that doesn't know how to live outside of a socialist society. And you can kind of see where their plans are going.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And it goes way beyond that. I mean, Birkenhead and Bertrand Russell talked about the transhuman agenda and the technocracy and how that was all going to be laid out. But I think it's worth pointing out, so Marcuse, and then, are you familiar with Klaus's new book is going to be The Great Narrative?
I've seen it, but I haven't read it yet.
I ordered it, which I hate
narrative.
To give him, but yeah, I hate to endorse him in any way, but I'm very, very curious. They tell you their plans, and the only way to know their plans is to read their writing. So they lay it all out. But I'm curious your thoughts on, to me, this is like another iteration of, Lyotard's meta-narrative. And also, I think it's going to combine, Marcuse's, because it's only one narrative that can be accepted into this great narrative.
Yes. So, it depends on how you read the postmodernists. You bring up Lyotard. I try to read them kind of cautiously and as taking what I can from them. And what I can take from them is that they're almost giving a warning. In fact, I think in the most charitable way to read them is that they're
charitable.
describing and warning. Well, I mean, that all got picked up and weaponized, and I don't know necessarily what some of their visions were, but Lyotard talks, for example, in the postmodern condition, where he lays out that postmodernity means skepticism toward meta-narratives. He also talks about this idea called legitimation by parology. And so parology is effectively a narrative believed by consensus. And so when you read the Great Narrative, you're seeing the intentional application of a meta-narrative. Now, Lyotard says that postmodernity is skepticism toward those things, and obviously they don't want skepticism toward it. So this is why I can look at Lyotard and say, oh, well, this is clearly, he's warning that this is a bad thing. Now, his crackpot is that he believed that everything is already that. Science is that, everything is that, liberalism is that, everything is already legitimized falsely through consensus belief, and that nothing's founded in actual reality. But what you actually have is this kind of weird reverse engineering of the postmodern texts. Same with, say, Baudrillard, who's talking about hyperreality and the kind of the realm of images that we all occupy. You can see that he's warning and despairing of the situation that we live in this kind of perfect propaganda world. And what you see is this reverse engineering and weaponization of it to achieve the Marcusean vision, which is a society of total control and sustainability, et cetera, that he, in the communist utopia, that he had in mind. So you're seeing people creating the great narrative intentionally to create a parology that we all have to be, that becomes the basis for legitimation. So they've weaponized that. There is a, correct consensus, and the experts and the technocrats and the stakeholders have figured it out, and everybody who's not on board with that is wrong and bad and evil, etc. So we all have to go along with that. They've reverse engineered Lyotard in the opposite direction. And same thing with Baudrillard. It's like, well, let's just create narratives. Let's just draw the map and tell people that's where they live, regardless of what's really going on. So, you have something like these truckers in Canada, and they don't cover it except to claim that it must be racist and fascist and transphobic or something, and they try to condition your reality to see the thing in this false way. No on the ground, no spending time getting to know what's really going on or anything. And you can actually see it happening now. It's like the spell is breaking and more people are seeing it happening. So what I see is, whatever the postmodernists' motivations were, you can read them as warning about, Foucault warns about technocracy. His whole thing about biopower is that if we start calling things, if we give things the authority of science that are actually politics, then you have this situation where the imprimatur of science is being used to push politics. And of course, he's kind of like, well, that's always what's going on. He's not quite that far. If you read in 78, 79, when he does his lectures on biopower, he's a little warm to science by that point. But generally speaking, he's still skeptical of it. He's still worried about it. But you can read very clearly, there's a warning. You look at everything that happened with the COVID pandemic, and you can just, if you know Foucault, you're like, holy crap, he was right. Not to endorse Foucault, because I think he was dangerously wrong and scary about a lot of things, but as a warning for how and this is what Marx did by calling what he did the scientific study of history, the invoking of the brand of science as a justification for why your politics have to be believed is something very dangerous. And so you see, again, the same idea has been picked up and then said, oh, biopower. And they didn't say we should, it's not that everything is bad, it's that everything is dangerous, as Foucault put it. They're like, no, that's great. That's a weapon. Let's use that. And so what you're actually seeing is this kind of all these postmodern ideas. I think we do live in postmodernity. When the advent of the internet brought us into postmodernity, whether we like it or not, mass broadcasting as well. They figured out that they can weaponize, they being a step ahead with leftist thought, figured out how to reverse engineer and weaponize these things against us rather than to use them as a justification to tear down. And if you ask yourself why, it's because they believed Marcuse, that the left has an intrinsic right to do what it's doing, and the right must be suppressed. As a result, it must actually be repressed in order to avoid fascism as it gets branded. And so they accepted their Marcuse and their fundamental entitlement to get to rule the world. And then they saw all these nice tools that the postmodernists were warning about, kind of ahead of their time, saying, no, this is what technology is allowing. And this is what the world we're going to live in looks like. And it's really bad, and despair. And they said, oh yeah, we can use that. We can create the hyper reality and force people to live in it. Let's call it the metaverse. We can tailor the narratives and call everything we don't like misinformation and disinformation. And we can suppress people and throw them out of social media under doctrine of repressive tolerance in order to enforce that. What do we have then? We have false consensus, parology. Then that's what's going to decide what's legitimate and not. So we can literally create a false consensus. There's even a meme. All the scientists agree. And then one, I don't. And it's like canceled. All the scientists agree. That's exactly how you create a false consensus. And that false consensus is what Lyotard was warning about when he talked about the legitimation by parology. And then, with the biopower, definitely we've lived in this biopower abuse techno state under the COVID regime. And it's just one piece after another. You can see that this has all been kind of reverse engineered in order to bring about the Marcusian revolution.
Yeah. And when you bring up that meme to tie in the fascism, right? All the scientists agree with those that have funded them.
Yeah, right. How about that?
Funny thing about that one. Yeah. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that because you did bring up that, that's what they used as their, I guess, justification was this rise of the fascist state, which we're very much seeing. I personally, I'll just preface by saying this, I personally don't think that they are divergent. I think that, I think all of these people who are, the elites that are trying to foist this agenda very much are aligned with both the Marxist agenda, and they're using that as a tool to merge the fascist corporatocracy, technocracy, global state.
Yeah, I think that actually one of the outcomes of the last half of the 20th century is that communism dialectically incorporated fascism, that they were always kissing cousins, but now they literally have done a synthesis and put them together into one thing. In China, what you can see, for example, is they have their market that operates under the purview of the CCP. And so you have a fascist state capitalist market happening underneath the communist regime. And we're seeing the opposite being built in the West. The fascism aspect, the corporations have the ability to do things that free governments don't have. Governments of free people don't have. And so they're using the corporations to do a fascistic move. And what are they putting inside of it? Equity. So it's communism. Whether it's environmental equity, whether it's social equity, whether it's, the other letter in their little tool is G for governance, but that just means hiring commissars in most regards to enforce the environmental and social equity models that they're trying to put forth. In other words, communism. So, but who's going to run it? Well, an oligarchy of corporate leaders and NGO partners working hand in glove in a public-private partnership with governments, which is by definition fascism. So the fascism is going to lead on this side. And of course, what you're seeing from the left is that they love fascism when it's theirs. They're not anti-fascist in the least regard. They love fascism if it's pushing their ideas onto everybody and forcing everybody to participate in their ideas, as they always have been. Scratch a leftist, find a totalitarian. It's just how it goes. And so I think that we're actually looking at, people don't know what to do with it, because it's neither pure old school communism, no Marxism or whatever, nor is it pure old school fascism. But in fact, it's this weird mixture of the two. And if you understand the nature of their dialectical religion, this makes perfect sense that they would do this in a multiplicity of ways. It makes perfect sense that obviously they're going to do this because they have to solve the production problem that the socialist states were never able to do, but the corporations obviously can do. So fascism delivers the goods. So let's go fascist and deliver the goods. But, communism never was quite able to. The other thing is if you have a communo-fascist China and you have a fascio-communist West, and those two are in dialectical relationship against one another, then those things are going to synthesize by the nature of how the master-slave dialectic plays out. And so there's too much harmony in the world, like to their theological worldview, to think that they didn't do that on purpose.
Exactly.
Communism and fascism are not, in fact, opposites. They are dialectical pairs. And so they can be synthesized together into a single program, but there are two ways you can do that. Just like teacher and student in Paulo Freire are dialectical pairs, they're in opposition, and you can synthesize them. And Freire in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed says to synthesize them into teacher students and student teachers. And then so the student teachers and the teacher students work together in a environment in which there is no intrinsic power relation, and they synthesize into one community. And so it's the exact same model that plays out in two different domains there. You can see it again in critical race theory, where black people are said to have double consciousness, both as being black but living within a white world. And then white people are granted by their white privilege the ability not to have that. So instead you have to awaken in them a white awareness, as Judith Katz phrased it, where, as Robin DiAngelo put it, is the goal is to become less white and to realize there's no such thing as a positive white identity, but you have to be aware of what the white identity actually is. So you awaken a self-loathing double consciousness in white people, and you awaken a self-prideful double consciousness in racial minorities, and then you put those people next to each other and let the dialectic play out. It happens again and again and again and again in all of their little religious enclaves. And so it's to see it at the greatest scale, where you're literally seeing the attempt to build what Orwell was talking about. That you have East Asia as communism with fascism inside of it, and then we're going to create Oceania that has fascism with communism inside of it, and the two are always going to be at war, but they're not at war. They're two peas in the same pod that are dialectical opposites, which means they're actually in a functional relationship to homogenize with one another over time. The opposition is only there to reveal contradictions so that they can be resolved, so that we end up with what? Communism that works this time. That's this dialectical solution, because it didn't work so far because it couldn't solve the production problem. But if you use the technology and the fascism and the corporatism at the heart of it, you can solve the production problem. China has one approach to that, and we'll see how that works. And the West will have a different approach to that, and we'll see how that works. But when you put them next to each other, the contradictions will reveal themselves, and they will synthesize out, and eventually will end one giant world homogenization of communism and fascism that has what as the result? Well, everybody's a social person now. Everybody's social man. Everybody lives in this socialist environment where everything is equitable and shared. But of course, there's a top tier that has to manage things because we need that. And, it'll self-justify, et cetera. But in the very, very long end, you don't need that either, because in fact, the machines will do that for you. The singularity will arise. The AI will order everything for everybody, and everybody else gets to be equal, period. Except, of course, Klaus is never going to allow himself to actually be equal. And so that's a contradiction that'll work out eventually, I guess. And you say, well, that's contradictory. It doesn't make sense. Well, it never makes sense. It never makes sense. It's all self-serving power grabs.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
They always think that they're the exception, right? So of course we're all going to be equal in the end, but not me. I'm the exception to this, because the world has to be ordered to make my subjectivity come to bear.
Right. So is there any way to combat all of this?
Well, actually, yes.
Right.
Partly is that they're combating themselves. I don't know if you saw recently, George Soros came out with his video just going after Xi Jinping. Not a big fan of that guy. And he's undoing a lot of the things that they are doing. He's on the attack against them. And so there's, on a certain level, like, well, let's get out of the way and let George do what George does, and because he's trained his guns on China right now. He's still doing his open society stuff. He's still meddling in Western elections. He's still trying to drag immigrants into every Western culture to do whatever weird open society visions he has. But he's also now just brazenly attacking Chinese interests. And so, one of the major players on the Western side and the major player on the Eastern side are now in conflict internally, because they have different visions for how it's supposed to go. So one thing is, well, let that happen. Let them keep fighting with each other. The other thing is it turns out that they can't, they can try to force people to do things, but they don't have the tools to force people to do things yet without getting violent, which is going to end up getting them deposed because they're massively outnumbered. And so they're trying not to get violent. They don't want to get violent. As a matter of fact, they want to push people into a social credit system where they can control us completely. Turns out, if you look ahead and see, this could lead to a social credit system. I'm not participating in that. And making massive amounts of noise at whatever, even if they're just weak and craven politicians you have who might take steps to prevent going into a social credit nightmare. It turns out that their iron grasp is not closed upon us yet. Unlike in China, where they have the social credit system and they have the problem, they can't get out of very easily by themselves. Okay, George, do your thing, carry on. But as far as with the West, not participating in this, saying, this COVID passport idea wasn't always a bad idea that wasn't going to work. It was always an evil idea that was going to try to control people. It was a step toward trying to control people. And then what are we doing in our corporations? Why is this ESG thing so dominant? And all it takes is a few people to start speaking up about why did we go down this road in the first place? What fraud was involved in installing this? And all of a sudden, all of it can start to fall apart. So there are lots of things. What can the average you or me do? We can make noise. It's about all we can do. And we can refuse to comply with things, even if it is inconvenient for us. We can support a massive supply chain disruption by the truckers if it breaks their ability to have power. and because they're controlling the supply chain otherwise, and they'll disrupt it when they feel like it, and they'll put it back when they don't, so that they can kind of cycle pressure on and off of people. So those kinds of things we need to actually, though, one of the things that's not happening that needs to be happening a lot more is people need to be putting a ton of pressure on elected officials to absolutely undermine all of this financial, I'm trying to not say a bad word, that's going on from the Federal Reserve, for example, the debasing of our currency and through inflationary measures and other things. All of this that actually led to that needs to be exposed. The people involved need to be held accountable, and we need people that have the power.
Federal Reserve Act should never have been ratified. Aldrich needs to go down.
Well, I mean, I was just speaking, I was just in Texas and spoke with Glenn Beck, and he was telling me, and I don't know the details of this, so I can't talk about it in an informed way yet, but he was telling me that, you know, if you look back at what happened through the financial crisis in 2008, and you start, this is now apparently, you know, in 2012, there was some kind of investigation, and then there was some very shady decision, he told me, and again, I can't speak to the specifics, but some very shady decision. And if people go watch the episode, it comes out this weekend. If people watch the episode I did with Glenn Beck at the beginning of February this year, I guess, just in case, you know, so they can find it, they can hear Glenn articulate it and what's actually going on. But there are these documents that were filed in 2012 that said it would be a massive national security disaster if the truth came out. And so it got buried for 10 years. And guess what? 10 years is up and it's coming out. And it turns out that it wasn't a few $1 trillion here or there. It was $30 trillion. And that trillions of dollars went to things like Chase Bank, and money kind of went all over the place. And if you start looking at where a lot of the deep inflation is really coming from, it's that there were these extraordinarily crooked things that happened with the financial industry in 2008 through 10, 12. And that's,
I would argue it goes back way further.
Oh, sure, of course.
But to see the things unravel into that.
Yeah, that's a very specific incident. So basically, you know, it does go back further. They've been running a very fraudulent economy for a long time. In 2008, that was nearly exposed.
Yes.
They nearly brought themselves to their own undoing, and they papered over it. And so for the last 10 years or so, we've been living on this weird borrowed time where everything is actually being orchestrated to protect the fact that they have broken themselves and are trying to do everything they can to hide that fact, cover up that fact, and to install social control systems to prevent people from figuring out just how horrifically they've screwed everything up and screwed everybody over.
I think that this may be an unpopular opinion, but I think it's one of the things that the GameStop incident really did do, was to kind of shine light on the fraud and the manipulation that's occurring. I think a lot, it exposed to some degree to people who would never have been even questioning it.
Right. Well, to me, what really the GameStop short squeeze, what it really revealed was the degree of corruption that exists, because all of a sudden, you know, these hedge funders got beat at their own game and got beat bad. And all of a sudden, the regular rules of the market were suspended in order to protect them. And so now, you know, something is very fishy. Like, we don't have a free market if the rules of the market suddenly get to be suspended, so that the kind of big almost parasitical players in the game get to be protected, you know, the second they get beat. And so, you know, the degree of corruption that is happening within that entire sector is really kind of the rot at the heart of our society. It's also one of, I mean, we talked about their technocratic visions and their transhumanist visions and all of this, you know, high-minded vision of a communist utopia with the Great Reset stuff. But the other side of it is that they know they're being exposed. They know it's coming. And so they have to put social control
before the fall, right?
Right. It's either that there's going to be an economic collapse. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. And they want to have absolute control, as Glenn Beck phrased it. There needs to be a global prison that's absolutely ironclad, or else they're going to be in big trouble when that comes. Or maybe there's not a collapse. I don't know. Maybe there's not one, but the internet is the internet, and people are going to figure out the crimes that they've been involved in. And all of this information is going to come out, and the demand for accountability is going to be so high that they're all going to go to prison or something, or worse, if they're exposed. And so what are they going to do? They have to have a complete control placed over the information environment. And probably what's gone on is that the banks and the big tech people, through their connections in Davos, have had a conversation. And it's basically like, scratch our back now, censor things, big tech, and we'll scratch your back later when everybody's angry at you, and we'll make sure the money's still there and that you guys are still, the elite of the elite. And we'll make sure that it's very difficult for any competitor to come in and depose you when people are become so angry at Facebook that they want nothing to do with it, for example. And so they've got this kind of illegal relationship going on there. If that's the case, I'm not saying that I know that that's going on, but it's plausible. And if that's the case, that's directly the same kinds of trust-based collusion that antitrust law exists and came into existence, in the early 1900s to end. And so history is rhyming, really. I've been saying this for a few years, is that we were seeing exactly the same problems of trust and monopoly that we saw at roughly the turn of the 20th century. And that's the ultimate problem. It's just that it's in different industries. It's not in steel and oil.
For different industries.
It's not steel and oil and railroad any longer. It's now tech, finance, and
but in many ways it is the same players, and it is their successors.
The Rockefellers are still in there doing it. It's still them.
Right, still them. And and a lot of the same industries too. It's just those industries have kind of morphed. I mean, the Rockefellers were very instrumental in taking over the medical industry. They really brought about the advent of the pharmaceutical industry. Rockefeller hired Alexander Flexner to do the Flexner Report of 1910, and then he defunded all the naturopathic schools, and only funded any institutions that had a pharmaceutical component, so that he could bring about petropharmaceuticals.
Right. The Rockefellers also built the health system in China soon thereafter. And so they got very involved in China in the 1920s and did very similar things.
Yeah. So you bring up China. I wanted to go back to China for a second, because your thoughts on what Soros is doing. I'm curious your thoughts on this, because when you think about the dialectic, I see China as very much a pawn in the dialectic. I might be wrong. It's just a theory that I have. I think, in many ways, the West empowered China for their own ends. And I do think it was just this dialectical ends. But they've kind of, and now I think China kind of plays footsie with the whatever you want to call it, the New World Order, the global elites, powers that be, whatever you want to call them. But it's the same structure. And I think they, for a long time, were going along because they had an aligned interest. And now I think China feels like they've been empowered so much that, it's all this rise to, a one world government. Who's going to be the controllers of this one world government, right? And I think China is starting to feel like, oh, well, maybe we don't need them. And that's where this conflict is.
I think that's right. Yeah, China has got big for its britches in this. And Kissinger made China what it is. That's where they had their whole little like opening up of the market program that actually came from Kissinger going over.
Andrew. Yeah.
And so Kissinger has a Chinese protege named Ronnie Chan. Ronnie Chan is the one who funded the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard for $500 million a few years ago, 2014. He just dropped 180 million or thereabouts on UMass and now owns their public school of public health. And Soros, though, is looking at this monster that's been built, and he's like, he wants an open society. He looks at China. He's like, that's not an open society. I don't want that. And so I don't want Xi in control. So all of a sudden, China's been, if Kissinger's really behind all of this like that, then the plan has always been to build China up to what it is now, so that the West will become something similar and then defeat it. And so the goal was always to play China. And China has now become very powerful and very influential. The tiger got loose, if you will. Tiger got out of its cage a little bit, and now you have players like Soros looking at this, and he doesn't want to live in China's world. And so he's like, well, we're just going to go ahead and start undermining that. And so, I think that is probably the source of that conflict. Of course, Soros is this interesting character because his vision doesn't align with everybody else's totally. He has his open society vision that's been his dream, like since Karl Popper was his mentor back in the day. That's been his dream. Open societies and their enemies was Popper's book from, what was it, 45 or 6 or 8, right after World War II. And looking at the Nazis and what makes a society open and not, and da da da. And so it's been his dream ever since then to have this thing that he sees as an open society, and he sees what's going on, with some of this as a means to that end. And you can tell he's a very utilitarian kind of guy. If you've listened to any of his interviews that he's done where he sounds like a blazing sociopath, you can tell he's a very utilitarian guy with his vision. But then he simultaneously sees China as a threat to achieving that. And so, now there's this tension there. China named him a terrorist. He's breaking their housing market and messing with some of their other interests. So, I don't know exactly what to make of that, but I think that why this is happening is not that difficult to ascertain.
Right. So going back to the, the ESGs and the corporatocracy, I think a lot of people don't, when you were saying how like some of the way we could combat some of this, that I think is hopeful. And I do agree. I think this is right, that more people need to step up in this regard. I think they're cowering because people don't want to lose their jobs, their position, they're afraid of the big corporations. But there is all this, they're trying in the efforts to implement the social credit, the, ultimately the carbon credit system. They're doing it through these corporations that have, the control. What I'm getting at is, there's really few conglomerates. They control the markets and they control all the other corporations, essentially, which control all the industries. So I guess maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and then how through, it's a two-pronged question, I guess, sorry, it's long-winded, but the first part of it is, how those industries are controlling things, like BlackRock,
Yeah.
And then the second part of it is through individuals, because I do think individuals can fight back on each of the ESGs, right? They don't need to comply with it. And if everybody just said no, then that whole thing would fall apart.
It can, yeah. So the second part, I agree with you. The first part, there are 3 primary mechanisms that these entities are using for control. One is admission and participation in the club. So Davos, you pay $250,000 or whatever a year to be in the club, and you get to meet with other big industry leaders. You get to meet with government leaders. You get to meet with these huge funding entities, these NGOs, and you get all this kind of, crony activity, access to crony activity. And so people are going along with it because if you don't sign the pledge, it's not just you pay your $250,000, you can be in the club. You got to sign the pledge. I don't know that there's literally a signing of the pledge, but they have a set of.
Klaus has the global, I think it's the Global Summit School. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to be able to rub elbows and be a crony and participate in the crony game, then you have to go along with the crony program. So there's the country club mechanism that they're using to control all of this. And ultimately, all that requires is people realizing that the members of the country club probably are going to hang from lampposts if this keeps going, and you don't want to be in that country club much longer, and they need to get out of that country club and do something different. So it's one of the mechanisms. Second mechanism is through asset management and investment. So right now you have these huge asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and so on. Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo are probably the top 4. And
State Street.
Yeah. That's another one. So there's your top 5. And so if you want to, have your assets managed at all, you have to cross a certain threshold score according to their little social program. If you want to have premium, ETFs made up for you to be included in premium ETFs for your company, you have to have even higher score. You're going to get ranked according to how good of an investment you are. et cetera. And the way that that ultimately gets broken is that shareholders stand up and prove that, because this is a divergent, this isn't net beneficial for the bottom line in terms of actually producing things. It's only within this fake artificial economic bubble that will eventually pop that it makes any sense. And so they are people who are signing on to these programs as their primary strategy are actually violating their fiduciary responsibility, which is super illegal. And if you get shareholders of the right level to be able to speak up and to take action in that regard, then you can actually start to break the grip of that asset management investment capital program through ESG. ESG is not a good measurement of future company success, except if there's the new world order. And
Right.
if you take away the assumption of the new world order, it is in fact not a very good predictor of company success. In fact, it's probably a good predictor of company failure outside of the artificial circumstances that they've created. And then the third one becomes more important then, because I mentioned shareholders. What's actually going on, and which would really cripple the entire program, is that entities like BlackRock, for example, is gigantic asset managers. Let's just simplify and pretend that they're just running a bunch of mutual funds. So what is a mutual fund? There's a whole bunch of stocks in a kind of a portfolio, and you give your money to that, and then they invest in however they're going to do it across this portfolio, whether it's through ETFs or whatever else. And so you've given, let's say, some amount of money that works out to where you own $100 worth of Apple stock. Let's just as an example. But you've done that, and a bunch of other people, hundreds or thousands of, probably maybe even possibly millions of other people and companies have done this as well. And so what happens is that on everybody's behalf, BlackRock becomes a 14 or 30% owner in Apple. You own like $100 of it. Somebody else owns like $300 of it, whatever. And it's really very diffuse where the ownership actually lies. But BlackRock is empowered to act as though they are a 30% owner in and of themselves. And if you prohibit, and this is just a legal decision that can be made, if you prohibit that ownership by proxy, giving people voting shares, then BlackRock can't show up and vote with 30% voting, because BlackRock doesn't own 30% of Apple.
No.
You and 40 other million people or whatever who've invested in portfolios that include Apple stock own 30% of Apple, and it's very diffuse. It's not. So what you have right now is a problem where these big asset managers have rigged the system to where if they're managing the assets and invest in some company, they get to act as though they're a de facto significant owner of that company, and so get an outsized voting share, and so in a sense become controllers of that company. But it's not because their money is invested in the company, it's because they are the conduit of other people's money to be invested in the company. And if you just make that, it's got a name, I forgot what the name is in finance, but that proxy voting, proxy representation, if you make that illegal, right. So yeah, 30% of Apple's stock maybe is owned by people who it's owned in a way where it's not clear who those shareholders are, maybe. But you can't have BlackRock come in and speak on behalf of them. If you limit the power there, you cripple this kind of thing, because these huge asset managers have huge amounts of money, and they therefore can just come in and buy huge amounts of a share of a company and basically take voting control over that company or close to it in illegitimate ways. And so, again, it's complicated, but if this is somehow addressed and limited, then it cripples their power. But those are the three main mechanisms by which this ESG lever toward, so the ESG is the lever toward the Great Reset, and the Great Reset is the lever toward the technocratic nightmare. And so this ESG lever actually has three major components is the only reasons that it's working. I guess a fourth is that it's a fad. There's always fads. It's just the hot, cool thing. Everybody's like, doesn't want to question it. It sounds great. It has a lot of cool literature and graphics and stuff. That's what business is doing. It's on its little cultish fad that it's in. And they are part of that cult. But the three other main mechanisms are that you have these big asset managers acting as shareholders and voting as though they are major shareholders. and then the investment and asset management access game that they're playing, which can be challenged by others and by shareholders. And then also that country club. If you want to rub elbows, if you want to become one of the global elite that everybody hates, then like they're even coming out and saying, we trust each other more and more, but everybody hates us. People trust us less and less. And it's like, if you want to be a part of that country club that everybody hates, play at your own risk. But that right there is the third of the major reasons that this is actually going. And I guess, like I said, the fourth is that it's a fad. It's a complete investment business fad, just like any other stupid fad that comes up and creates bubbles and causes damage in the long run.
Right. Yeah, for sure. For sure. So when we were talking about the dialectic, I believe that, a lot of the attack is certainly they want to take down the West, but I think a lot of the bulwark of that is America, because we have our Constitution and self-governance experiment that hopefully will continue to last. Although, right now it's not looking great, but hopefully, but I think they've used this pitting us against each other. I will just come out and say, I believe, that the Republican Party was created, not necessarily ideologically left versus right. I think that's different from Republican versus Democrat, but I do believe the Republican Party was created to be controlled opposition for the left. That's my personal view. I think one of the key giveaways for that is like their tagline, hold the line. If you're playing, the analogy I always use is if you're playing a game of tug of war, and you hold the line, if somebody's pulled an inch, you're now an inch further, right? You hold the line again, you're now 2 inches. And before you know, you're down the road, you're really far away. And so they never really pull back. And I think that that's instrumental to the left winning. And by the left, I'm referring to the global elite left, totalitarians who want to usher us into a one world government. So I think it's, that it's imperative for them that they crush the right in a lot of ways. And by the right, these terms have been convoluted and distorted in so many ways that I'm hesitant when I use the terms, but I'm not talking about like the far right fascist group, I'm talking about more of like the, traditional founding father type right movement. So I think that they really have to attack them. So I'm curious though, I feel like the right though, a lot of times we had talked about this and you had such a great analogy of like they go looking for the rake and step on it and smack themselves in the face, and I really do feel that there is a lot that we can save the extremist for, we can discuss them as well, but I'm really talking more the people who, the traditional kind of right. I think they're doing a huge disservice to themselves a lot of the time when they have opportunities. What are some things you see about like what they are doing and what they could do to help this movement right now? Because I think the far left is being exposed. Even the left is leaving the far left, and they have been for a while.
The problem, you were right. I don't know if it was created that way or not, but the Republican Party is certainly largely controlled opposition, or at least what we would call the establishment Republicans.
Exactly.
are deeply controlled opposition, and they're caught by the same snares, mostly money and access to the country clubs, etc. The elites they basically arranged what all the cool stuff is, and so you're always caught in this dilemma. Like, let's say you're kind of an establishment Republican type guy, and you generally do have the right ideas and you do want to resist, but you hear this from teachers a lot, by the way, too, is that you're not going to be effective if you go up against the machine. So you're going to be somebody who swallows a little bit of it and tries to split your allegiances so that you can be the good guy on the inside. Like, so we have somebody who's actually, let's say, against Marxism. He's a Republican, but he's establishment type because he thinks that it's his only way to get in and play the game. If you just get excluded from the game, you can't do it. So you see this, I said, you hear this from teachers. They're like not on with the woke stuff, but they don't want to quit because they want to be the good guy that's in there to try to change it from within, but they're so hamstrung by the incentives in play that it actually works out to where they just kind of become controlled opposition. You have other people who are just paid for. You have other people, the communists have bragged for a century about infiltrating the Republican Party. And there are a number of them, and I don't know who to name, that are actually communists posing as Republicans. And so my usual guess right now, since the Tea Party movement kind of started to change the direction of the conservatives, is that it's probably somewhere between 40 and 50% of the Republican Party is useful, and 50 to 60% therefore is controlled and by one means or another, and not able to do what they need to do to resist this, or are actually on board with making sure that while the small things get stopped, the small things that are actually driving people crazy get stopped, the big shift continues without slowing down in any meaningful way. In other words, their job is to be a calming agent to the public. So they come out, and this is what people report all the time, and they're not wrong to report it. They come out and they say all the right things, and then they don't do anything to actually stop the change. Right. They say all the right things, and then they just either don't play the politics the hard way that they need to play them in order to fight back against an organization that is fighting to win, is playing for keeps. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, some of which comes down to weakness. They don't want to be perceived as a hardliner. They don't want to be called an extremist. The magic spell that the left has been using about right-wing extremists has been extremely effective. It's more effective than the racist. It's more effective than, the sexist or homophobe or transphobe, any of those accusations.
I think it's being a lie, but yeah.
Right-wing extremist has been a far more effective magic spell for them to control the opposition. And so you could have totally clear-eyed Republicans who won't take action because they're so scared they're going to get named an extremist, because that magic spell hasn't broken yet. The idea that you're a hardline conservative hasn't. Everything they do, they think they're wizards, is a magic spell to get people to do what they want them to do. And they're so afraid of that label. Another label they use very effectively that hasn't broken but is breaking now is conspiracy theorist. So if you say that there's actually an agenda to break America, well, you're just a conspiracy theorist. You're a crazy person. It's always one of the three. They have three things they do. I've said this in a million podcasts and a million talks. They drain epistemic authority by making people look like they don't know what they're talking about. They don't really understand the issue. They're the party of stupid. We've heard that for years. Yeah. They drain moral authority. They make you look like you're a bad person. Republicans are all a bunch of racist hicks, etc. Or they drain psychological authority. They're a bunch of conspiracy theorists. They're crazy. They can't be believed. They're not credible. And it's just those three tools over and over and over again. And so many Republicans, some of them are still afraid to be called a racist. I still hear it from them. Well, they're going to go after me and call me a racist. That one's finally caving in, but they're afraid to be called conspiracy theorists, and they're afraid to be called right-wing extremists. Then you take an example like Marjorie Taylor Greene, with whom you don't have to agree with everything. I think a lot of what she's saying is pretty great, and some of it I'm like, okie dokie, not really on board with some of those views.
Yeah.
She just had this whole thing, and I get it with the context of Ukraine about, total America first. And I think that isolationism has always been kind of a bad plan, which isn't to be the same as saying we should intervene a lot and get our hands on everything. And we don't need to be doing that either. But if we completely ignore what else is going on in the world, there's a reason Putin's pushing that talking point. There has to be a balance. So she goes too far for me on some things, but that's fine. That's fine. We're allowed to disagree, etc. But what you see is, how do they treat her? They throw her off of social media. She's banned from Twitter, right? They have tried to impeach her repeatedly. They constantly are going after her. She's the kind of held up as a scapegoat, as the crazy person, and all of this. And why? The reason is because she's actually taking effective action. She's forcing them to do votes where everybody's going to see who voted for what. She's actually saying things that they don't want to have said. She's taking stands that they don't want to have taken. And so, despite the fact that I don't agree with everything Marjorie advocates for, I think that we actually need about 300 Marjorie Taylor Greenes in Congress right now. I would much rather have 300 of her than anything like what we have right now. And But what do? She's crazy.
Right.
She doesn't understand anything. She's a stupid hick. She's, they just the same three. She's a racist. The same three things: right-wing extremist, racist, crazy person, QAnon, da 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 da. And they just absolutely continually use these same three techniques. And so many Republicans are just taken in by it. Well, I don't want to look like I'm crazy. Then like I said, then you have other ones who are paid to, straddle the line and fail on purpose.
Yeah.
And they're paid handsomely by the regime to make sure that, and I don't mean necessarily by checks, it's opportunities or other ways to pay people. Your political career depends on this, because if you don't, look what we'll do to you. Look what we did to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who doesn't play our game. You want that to be you? Say Marco Rubio, do you want that treatment? No? Okay, well, straddle the line and don't do anything effective.
Right.
There's so many different ways. Like, and Paul Ryan even came out and talked about how, he's the youngest Speaker of the House or whatever it was that he had. And he talked about how he got in and he played the game. He just played the game viciously and ruthlessly. And the game itself is corrupt as hell. And they use the fact of, well, if you want to be effective, you're going to have to climb the ranks. If you want to climb the ranks, you're going to play the game. And that's how the swamp, or whatever you want to call it, or the deep state or whatever, actually achieves its goals. And so you even just have like a dozen people like Marjorie and Thomas Massey's like her as well, who come in and that are elected in, and they absolutely refuse to be cowed by these accusations. They know who they are. They stand up for what they believe in, and they keep pushing. It doesn't really matter what their views are. If you actually have, even a dozen solid, honest people who are conservative in Congress, it's going to cause a massive amount of trouble for them. Just like, with the progressives, they only have the squad is only 5 people, and they're able to jerk Congress around by the nose constantly by creating all this stupid noise, primarily on social media, and looking like idiots to anybody with half a brain. You get a dozen hardcore conservatives, and that just won't back down and don't fall for these things. It's going to be very effective. But you see what they're doing. And you see why the Republicans, it's so hard, because you have to categorize all these different things. People who are bought off, people who are just craven and want to play the game and rise to the top. They have other selfish motives. But then you just have people who are afraid. And they're afraid to get called a right-wing extremist, or afraid to get called a conspiracy theorist. They might still be afraid to be called racist or transphobic, or any of these other stupid names that the left very effectively calls people. And that's their casting of magic spells. And it's a magic spell. And let me tell you a secret. Magic isn't real. It's only real if you believe it. That's how magic spells work. They only work if you believe them. And if you stop believing them, they have no control over you. They call you a conspiracy theorist, and you're like, yeah, they're right a lot, aren't they? And you just move on with your day. Like Alex Jones has a better track record than any of you. Like,
98%.
So, unfortunately for you, unfortunately for you, that doesn't have any power over me anymore. Like, a lot more people need to, if I were speaking to Republicans or elected officials, that's what I would tell them. Stop letting the magic spells work on you. They're just words. They don't actually have any power.
I definitely agree with that. And I definitely agree with that for the masses. They need to stop buying into that. I think part of the problem is that the deep state, if you will, these organizations, that, particularly the intelligence organizations, start categorizing these terms, right? So you have things like the racist comes out of hate speech, right? Mm-hmm. The conspiracy theorists, that actually came out of, it's a document 1035-960, which was the CIA document to avert any investigation into the Warren Commission. They would just label everybody a conspiracy theorist. So, then when you talk about the right-wing extremists, that's a domestic violence extremist, So that is part of the problem, is that create this,
It's been a strategy from the communists. Use a strategy. Bella Dodd talks about it in her testimony in the 50s. It's as soon as there's any kind of pushback, just start labeling people by these different names, and label communists by very virtuous names, and label all their enemies by extraordinarily rude names, like fascist in particular would be one, but conspiracy theorist would be another. Anybody who's against the regime is going to get this label attached to them. And this is ultimately that kind of linguistic or logocentric magic that all of these stupid, basically Hegelian ideologies operate within. And it's all like, in a sense, kind of very practical magic. But again, it's the only way it works is when people believe it. And so, they put out this reflexive push to get people to say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy theory. Only crazy people believe that's a conspiracy theory. And the way that it works is enough people believe that you create social enforcement away from those things. The way that breaks is enough people say, this is a magic spell. No, we're not going to do this. We're not participating in this any longer. And that's what's necessary. Everyday people need to, like for critical race theory, for example, being called a racist right now literally just means a critical race theorist wants to control you. That's all it means.
Yeah.
If you're being called a racist within the context of critical race theory having any social purchase whatsoever, or especially if somebody who subscribes to critical race theory or doesn't oppose it is the one calling you a racist, more than likely the reason you're being called a racist is because a critical race theorist wants to control you, or a leftist wants to control you. And when you realize that that's all it means, is that this person's trying to control you, it's not to say that the word is completely useless, but that's basically what's going on. Same thing with misinformation. Yep. You say something, they call you a conspiracy theorist, or say you're peddling misinformation. All it means is they want to control your speech. That's all it means. In the context we exist in, yes, those words actually otherwise would have meaning. But in the context that we've been forced to exist in, because they push this stuff out like they have, that's all those words mean any longer. Racist, critical race theorist wants to control me. Conspiracy theorist, some blue anon wants to control me. Some blue-pilled, narrative swallower wants to control me. Misinformation, same thing. The people who believe the narratives want to control me. They don't want their narratives. They're great. It's a great narrative. They don't want it disrupted. And as people begin to realize this, I think they call that process red pilling. As people begin to realize this more and more and more, those spells lose purchase, and they're going to have to start coming up with new words and new terms and new accusations, like they tried with domestic violent extremist. And people are like, no, not real. This isn't correct. We're parents,
Right. For parents. Exactly. So you were talking about Marxism as a religion earlier, and I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you brought up a really, really, I thought, such an astute point about the Supreme Court and how, they should declare it a religion and keep it. So I don't know. I would think that this is a great thing for the, religious conservatives to take issue with. This is something.
I mean, they should,
right?
They should. Everybody should, really, but the religious conservatives could really speak powerfully into this.
Yeah.
But Marxism as a religion, people need. I mean, I think it's so important to understand it that way, because it achieves obviously huge legal implications with the First Amendment in the United States. Namely, it's not in schools anymore, is it? And it's not in any government agency anymore, is it? You're not doing it in the military anymore, are you? And it's not the police department anymore, is it? All of those things is extremely important to realize. But it also triggers, I think, Americans, even most religious Americans, though not all, have a pretty deep revulsion to the idea of any religion being able to be forced upon anybody else. The idea that you would force religion on people is so anti-American. And in fact, I don't think there's a more anti-American value. So the people on the right who are, I consider them enemies, who want to force religion on people, are anti-American at the core, because the purpose of founding America, if we recall, it was pilgrims who came here, namely Calvinists.
I would also argue it's antithetical to most religions. Most religions.
It is.
Yeah,
It is. It's antithetical to Calvinism for certain.
Yeah.
Calvinist, which is considered by a lot of people to be like the hardest core brand of Protestant Christianity that there is, Calvinism straight up says that, that his predestination by God determines who's going to be saved and who's not. And so they have like a little rhyming saying, as they often do, as a man converted against his will is of the same opinion still. They say these kinds of things. It is actually inimical to the religion. The freedom of religion is though the foundational principle that led to the creation of America. We can talk about John Locke, and we can talk about life, liberty, and property. We can talk about Jefferson putting it as a pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal, and imago Dei, and creator, and natural law, and all of that stuff's very important. But what the spark that led to colonizing this continent in the first place was actually religious liberty. It was literally that the Calvinists were getting kicked out of Europe for reasons that people who deal with Calvinists sometimes understand. They were getting kicked out of Europe, and they wanted to come to a place where they could practice their faith the way they wanted to. And so the First Amendment, not like the 11th, not like the 73rd, the First Amendment straight up says the government will, I mean, it's about freedom of speech too, but it's really about freedom of conscience is what it's about. You will not be, you won't have your freedom of speech abridged, but you are going to be given freedom of religion. The government cannot tell you how you have to believe. You will be protected. It will make no law regarding the establishment of religion or the preventing the free exercise thereof. And so freedom of religion is the first core principle that this country was about. We're going to be the first country on the planet that doesn't tell people what they have to believe religiously. So if you want to be a Christian, if you want to be a Catholic as opposed to a Protestant, if you want to be a Sikh, if you want to be Buddhist, if you want to be Muslim, welcome to America. Get a job. It's literally you can't be barred by the level of the government, and because of protections that have been brought in since. You can't be barred from gainful employment. You can't be barred from things like home ownership, etc., based on the contents of your faith. And so this is a fundamental principle. It protects religion from interference from the state as well. You can't render unto Caesar which is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. If Caesar is coming along and telling you how you have to organize your faith to be part of the state, you can't do it. You can only do so by being in defiance of the state to keep your religion, which is the point of America, is not to have that. So what was all that about? The point is that Marxism as a religion requires absolute submission to the socialist man program. Everybody has to fully submit to the idea that they're social men who understand themselves in accordance with Marxist theology. This is a complete imposition of religion. And so people have this deep, Americans in particular, but also people around the world who have adopted this free idea, the idea of freedom, have this deep revulsion, not just legally, but practically, to being told what they have to believe. What the contents of their conscience actually have to be. And so the second if it were to be properly designated as a religion, people are going to say, well, there's a reason it got properly designated as a religion, and go door knocking somewhere else. I don't really sell your crazy somewhere else. We're all stocked up here, whatever it happens to be. You don't Americans have no problem in general telling people of a different religion to piss off. But if they don't see Marxism as a religion, that instinct isn't triggered in them to tell them, I don't believe your faith. I just don't believe, you want to talk about racism that way, that's fine. That's your religion. I'm not part of your religion. And then we know it's a religion now. It's literally a religion. So I'm not participating in your religion about racism, about the magic structural forces that shape all of society, that condition who you are. No, I'm a free, independent individual. It was created in the image of God, or that is just a free individual that doesn't need any of that in my life. People can say that when they understand what it is.
Yeah. And I hope more people start to recognize that. And really, so sorry to interrupt. I hope you are enjoying it. Unfortunately, I've had 2 strikes, and as you know, the third one is not so charming. So we do continue. It's about 40 more minutes, a little more like 40 plus. I don't remember exactly how long, but there's about 40 more minutes. But during this time, we're about to talk about some topics that, aren't so friendly to this platform. So I hate to have to do this, but it's a great time to tell you to go follow me on Rockfin. I will post the entire thing there. I will make it free. If you want to support my work, feel free to tip me, but it will be free. I am really just trying to avoid being kicked off here. So I apologize for not being able to put the whole thing up, but I do hope you've enjoyed it thus far, and that you'll come over to Rockfin and follow me there and continue to watch the rest of it. And as always, let me know if there's anything I can do to make this a more enjoyable and more valuable experience for you.